Hello there, Scott Spann here, speaking to you from my sailboat office here in Sausalito, asking myself the question I ask all of the clients that I work with: what am I trying to cause here, now? And what I want to have be different in the world when this conversation is done is the realization that what seem to be impossible problems are not impossible. We just simply don't yet understand the tools that are available to us to be able to address these things. So I'm going to walk you through a short story about someone who thought that this was impossible. As a bit of a refresher, you remember that in our first blog we talked about the why that we're doing this, that there's a rate of emergence of complex multi-stakeholder problems at an increasing rate, things like food, water, energy, economy, healthcare, other sorts of things, and that our traditional ability to solve for those at best doesn't keep up with it. Some say are actually making things worse. And the concern that we're trying to address here is this bigger problem, this growing gap between the rate of emergence of complex multi-stakeholder problems and our traditional ability to solve them. The thing we talked about in the second blog was this notion of a complexity mindset and how we want to be in this upper left-hand quadrant here, that most of the problems we're trying to solve for exist in realms of relatively high uncertainty. They're complex problems. The solutions there are emergent, and they respond best to a self-organizing network as opposed to a hierarchy or an autocracy. This piece here now is about confronting impossible challenges. So I'm simply going to tell you a story about one of those situations. A good friend of mine, Mickey Conley, of a company called Conversant that you really should look up. They specialize in high-quality conversations and relationships in the workplace. Conversations that allow you to enter into ongoing cycles of value, where the cycles of value create a virtuous cycle, as opposed to cycles of waste, which they define in their world. And I highly recommend taking a look at that body of work. At any rate, Mickey had brought me in at one point when they were stymied around their strategy and asked me to come in and apply the methodology I developed for dealing with this kind of complexity in their case. And it was a very successful engagement. They got a lot out of it. And a few weeks later, Mickey called me up and said, you did this on a small scale. Can you do it on a larger scale? And the larger scale they were talking about was a global notebook supply chain, much bigger scale than I'd worked with Mickey. And in fact, this global notebook supply chain had a very unique challenge. They had to triple the output of their global supply chain over a 3-year time frame. Now, I had a conversation with their chief of staff about this. I asked them, what have you tried so far? They said, well, we sent out to all the different divisions in the field, asking them what were the kinds of things we needed to be able to do in order to triple output over a 3-year time frame. And by the way, this was at a point in time when the existing supply chain was barely keeping up. So this wasn't like they had a robust, healthy supply chain and they just simply needed to scale what they were already doing. They were already struggling just to keep up and to keep things from busting. They sent out a request to the field. The field came back with 127 different initiatives about what would be needed in order to meet the demand of tripling output over a 3-year time frame. And of course, there's no way anyone can do 127 initiatives. And so I said, well, where are you now? And they said, well, we narrowed that down to 25. And I said, well, would you bet your 401k on those 25 projects? And he said, hell no. That was a function of who had the most power, who was the loudest, who had the most budget, and so forth. But it wasn't a rational, logical, analytical discussion. And I said, well, what if we could get it down to 5 to 7 things that everyone in the executive team agreed if we work on these 5 to 7 things, we can triple the output of our global supply chain over a 3-year time frame. And he said, can you do that? And I said, absolutely. And I explained to him how. So he went back to the head of the global supply chain in Shanghai and made the pitch. First of all, he discussed it with his team. The team in charge of this effort came back and said, yes, let's do it. He went back to the head of the supply chain. The head of the supply chain said, that's impossible. No one can do that. So when he was relaying this story back to me, and I had my Conversant partner on the phone at the same time in this conference call, it just occurred to me to say, well, let's make a bold, to make a bold offer. And the bold offer was, look, we'll do the work for free. You pay us only if we succeed. And there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. And he came back and said, that's a pretty bold offer. And I said, well, it should be. If we're telling you that we can accomplish this, then we should put our money where our mouth is. So based on that bold offer, they accepted. And then 1 month later, and that was the other issue, was they had a very, very tight time frame. And I offer this story because I think it's valuable to see that not only can things that seem to be impossible be accomplished, it can be done in a relatively short period of time. It doesn't take 6 months or a year. So 1 month later, we showed up in the room with the executive team. And at the end of that first day of a 2-day offsite, if I remember it was 2 days, I believe, at the end of that first day, the head of the supply chain turned to the chief financial officer and said, please write them their check. They've accomplished what we thought was impossible. About 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the chief of staff. He said, you wouldn't believe what's happening here. The systems map you created and the analysis that we did is up on the walls and the halls throughout the facility, which was based in Houston, and there was also a facility in Shanghai, but the primary facility was based in Houston. And he said it's being used by the different teams for the first time to understand where they fit in the supply chain. No one had ever seen at a glance what the global supply chain looked like. They didn't have a really clear understanding of where they fit in it. They just knew they had a job. They didn't know how their job impacted other parts of the organization. And they had very little understanding or no understanding whatsoever of the ripple-on effect, how what they do affects one organization, a part of the organization affects another and another. They further didn't have an understanding of, at a deeper level, of the systemic nature of what was going on. And so HR was using this to recruit people, divisions were using it to orient people, they were using it to strategize and to choose what were their next initiatives going to be. And there were certain insights, and I'll share a couple of those insights. And again, I'm going to keep the company's name private because this is a business client and I had to sign an NDA and that sort of thing. But one of the insights that came out of that was the challenges that the logistical department faced, the logistics guys that were in charge of shipping. On the front end of the process, in the system as a whole, a year in advance of a shipment, the sales group would make a bid about how were they going to how many units were they going to sell for the year? And based on that estimate, logistics then bought container space a year out to be able to get it at a decent price. Well, if sales didn't estimate properly, for whatever the reasons were, that is, typically sales departments will underestimate their sales so they don't get in trouble at the end of the year by overestimating sales, and then the whole thing falls apart. So they would underestimate sales to make sure that they would have a safe margin in there. Well, the problem was when you got to the end of the year and then the sales were actually higher than the budgets that had been proposed, the logistics person had to end up buying shipping space on the spot market. Now, they either had to buy that container space on the spot market to get, say, the computers to Chase Bank or to Amazon or whoever they were shipping them to on time to maintain customer satisfaction. But when they did that, because they were buying on the spot market and the margins in the industry are so thin, they would erode their profit. If they chose not to erode their profit, then they delivered late, which damaged customer satisfaction, which damaged their ongoing relationship with the client. So that one decision a year earlier rippled all the way across the whole system to someone that they were never even thinking of when they made those estimates a year before, and ended up damaging either profit or customer relationship, neither one of which you can afford to damage. So that then opened up the opportunity for conversations between the sales group and the supply chain group about how do we solve this kind of a problem. Another insight that came was that, and this came out of the marketing side, was that marketing wanted to be able to offer a variety of options to the buyer. Oh, you want this color with this size hard drive and this display and this kind of a keyboard layout, and I'm kind of shooting in the dark here, but there were different models they came up with. Well, when you move out of a basic set of models, the original equipment manufacturer in Shanghai has to set up the development, the manufacturing chain for a particular model. When they hit a problem in the first runs of that model, they have to call on the teams that develop those computers to help them solve the problem on the supply chain, on the production line. The problem then is if you multiply the number of models you have, you typically do that using the same design team. So when a production line breaks down and you have to cannibalize that design team to solve the problem, if you have more than one breakdown in your production line, then suddenly your development team, your design team isn't available to help you solve for that. And all of a sudden you've got all of these idle production lines which are costing you a fortune. So the realization from that was to work with marketing to reduce the number of offerings or somehow consolidate the number of offerings or distribute the production of those offerings in such a way that you don't create a bottleneck in the design teams when production goes awry. So it was those kind of insights that were impossible to see or understand or even have a conversation about when you were talking about the bits and pieces of the organization versus the system. So I'm showing you at a glance here, and it's deliberately blurred so you can't see who the company is, but I want to show you at a glance here that this was the kind of a model that we were able to develop inside of a month, and it's eminently learnable. This is not rocket science to do one of these models. I'll show you some of the instructional videos how you can do one of these. I'll admit there's a high-level video I do, and I wouldn't expect you to be able to do a model like this, but if we do a deeper training, then you can see how would you create a model like this. So that's an example of what someone thought was impossible. We did it on spec. We got paid and ended up having a tremendous impact. And the beauty of it was that it speaks to that term I use from time to time about effortless leadership, that once we were clear about the reality we were trying to create and the structure that created that reality, we were able to identify the leverage points in the system. We did get to the 5 to 7 places to push in this system in order to affect the outcome they were seeking, tripling the output of the global supply chain over a 3-year time frame, and then they were able to get into action doing that. So I'm Scott Spann. If you're watching this anywhere else but on my blog, scottspann.com, please head over there. That's where the conversation happens. So leave a comment. What did you like? What did you not like? What are the complex problems you're trying to explore? What are things you'd like us to explore together? Really appreciate your listening and your comments. And I truly hope you're thriving today. Take good care. Bye-bye.